Kia ora koutou. My name's Nikki Hessell and I'm an Associate Professor of English at Victoria University of Wellington in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm very grateful for the invitation to speak about new frameworks to transform Romanticism. As a member of the Bigger Six Collective, I subscribe to the idea that Romanticism in its present institutional form is thoroughly incompatible with anti-racism. And I want to talk today about one way of changing the form of Romanticism to meet the challenges of our moment. I'm speaking to you from Te Herenga Waka marae, our campus marae. I'm inside the wharenui today, the meeting house. This is a space I've been teaching in for the past couple of years when I teach my Romanticism and Indigeneity course. And so today I want to talk about a treaty-based Romanticism, one that's rooted in Indigenous spaces and accountable to Indigenous knowledge and pedagogies. Too much decolonial work in English studies involves adding one or two texts to an existing syllabus without changing the critical framing or pedagogical decision-making. We need to keep in mind not simply that a syllabus is a political document, but that a syllabus, especially in the settler colonies, is embedded in discussions about sovereignty, about land, and about self-determination. In my own case then, it seems obvious that the syllabus for this course needed to be modelled on both the document and the philosophy that is the Treaty of Waitangi, Aotearoa New Zealand's founding document, which codifies the relationship between Māori and Pākehā, that is, settler New Zealanders of European descent, and models the kind of partnership we might imagine in higher education. What would a treaty-based Romanticism look like? In a simple sense, a treaty model suggests balance and partnership. Rather than one or two Indigenous texts, half of the syllabus needs to be given over to Indigenous voices. And it's important that this division does not simply pertain to the primary texts. If we leave the secondary works as is, consisting entirely of work by white or non-Indigenous thinkers, then we are surrendering the intellectual and critical power to the white academy, making Indigenous texts and peoples objects of study, but not framers of the context and its meanings. So I took the partnership model as a guiding principle. Half of the texts, both secondary and primary, had to be Indigenous authored. That brings me to the question of the classroom itself. A significant aspect of the privileging of settler knowledge and education is the fact that we teach in spaces that manifest settler institutions and their epistemologies. Bringing Indigenous texts, authors, and indeed students into these spaces has the potential to be, at best, decontextualising, and at worst, culturally dangerous. We have the good fortune here at Victoria University to work on a campus that has a marae, and that marae is made available as a teaching space in some circumstances. It was important to me to teach some of the content of this course inside the wharenui, the meeting house that I'm in today, for a number of reasons. First, I wanted to acknowledge in a tangible way the wharenui as a site of learning, knowledge, and pedagogy. The countries that are now the settler colonies already had institutions of higher learning before Europeans arrived, and marae, including modern marae like this one, remain as institutions of higher learning. This wharenui holds its own history as the first to be built in any university in Aotearoa, New Zealand, but also because it was explicitly designed to include connections to peoples and places all over the country and indeed the world. The name of this marae, Te Herenga Waka, which is also the Māori name for the university as a whole, means the hitching post, a place where anyone can hitch their canoe. This latter point is especially manifested in the carvings you might be able to see around me, which are of ancestors from a range of different iwi, tribes or nations, so that anyone visiting can find their place and feel protected here. Secondly, I wanted to have some of these conversations about Romantic literature in sight of those ancestors, by which I mean I wanted them to have me in their sights. Part of my accountability in this course is to be willing to sit at the feet of tipuna Māori, that is Māori ancestors, and present some of my thinking for challenge, dismissal, agreement or dispute. At the very least, I and my students would not be allowed to imagine that the histories we were discussing were neutral or forgotten. But I take a more literal interpretation of accountability here. The wharenui, as you might be able to see, is big, much bigger than a regular seminar room. And so we had to choose where to sit when we came into this space. I chose to sit at the foot of Kahanunu, my children's tipuna, for the protection he would offer me as a wider member of his whānau, his family, and for the check he would provide on my arrogance or ignorance. Teaching at the marae also recalibrated some of the structures of our classroom. It's a condition of using the marae as a teaching space that the class first has to take part in a pōhiri, a formal welcome, on their first visit, which inevitably changes the way we think about how we're using our time in class, who is in charge of the conversations and the shape that they will take, and what it means to consider romanticism in 21st century Aotearoa New Zealand. More practical things shaped the wharenui-based classes as well. While you can set up a ring of chairs if you want to, we used the long pillows on the ground, and thus we held our bodies in different ways while we were here. We took a coffee break in every session, but at the marae we moved into the wharekai, the dining room, when we had this break, meaning we were in a more informal space for conversation. The marae, in gentle but forceful ways, made us think, act, and talk differently. So what did we talk about while we were here? In my initial course planning, I had planned to teach all of the Indigenous material in the wharenui. As my thinking developed, however, I became concerned that that approach was a binary one rather than a treaty-based one. Separating the British and Indigenous authored texts out and saying one corpus belongs in a university seminar room and one belongs on the marae, potentially segregated or, worse still, ranked material that I was arguing was permanently intertwined. For that reason, I taught the North American part of the course in our usual seminar room, and we moved to the marae on the day we were talking about Māori and Pacifica texts. But I also wanted to break up the British material too. So I taught a session on Wordsworth here as well. I wanted to bring Wordsworth into the wharenui, to lay his poems at the feet of the ancestors and ask them what they made of him, and to think about Wordsworth alongside the students in this radically different space. Ko wiramu waitohu tēnei, this is William Wordsworth, I wanted to say to the ancestors. Pēhea o whakaro, what are your thoughts? Romanticism, it seems to me, is always saturated in questions of indigeneity, even if this is not what we immediately think of when we consider the boundaries of our field. When I was briefing the students on what to expect before we moved our class to the marae, I told them that we would gather before our first class in the wharenui by the waharua, the carved gateway on the main campus street front. One of the students commented that she didn't know where the waharua was and didn't think she'd ever seen it. She then laughed at herself and said, "Will it be really obvious once I look for it?" I laughed too and said, "Yes, it will be really obvious once you look for it." That seems to me to be the perfect metaphor for the role Indigenous thought, lifeways and peoples play in romantic studies. It has always been there, and it's really obvious once you look for it. Indigenous studies can form its own kind of waharua, its own kind of gateway into romantic studies, but we will all need to keep our eyes open if that's going to happen.